Okay, seems to be working everywhere, so we'll get going. Welcome to Playing with Unicorns, episode 10. This week we're going to be discussing how to validate your startup idea. Make sure that the idea you have will allow you to build a scalable billion-dollar company and a unicorn. Let's get going. So last week we discussed how to come up with brilliant business ideas. The issue is often that the idea, while important, um, does it while actually the genius is in the execution, the idea does matter. And you need to make sure that you pick the right idea because once you're going down the path, like pivoting is actually extremely difficult. And so before you actually go and do a lot of the things that I discussed in prior episodes, like going to build your MVP, etc., you need to make sure that the idea is worth pursuing. And so we've created a framework for validating ideas. And that framework really involves 6 different steps. So first, you're gonna, you're gonna divide key hypotheses, and then you're gonna test these hypotheses. And these key hypotheses, there's 6 of them that you actually want to be validating. So one is the market big enough to support a billion-dollar company? Um, there's nothing wrong with necessarily small companies or small markets, but ultimately here our objective is to build these billion-dollar companies that can change the fate of humanity, hopefully. And so making sure that you're going after a large enough market matters. And I'll talk about how you value that. Number 2, how competitive is the market? Is it a red ocean or a blue ocean? Or are there large competitors facing you? And if so, is it still worth pursuing because perhaps you have a different approach and the market is not winner take all? Or should you move away to another category? And then thinking through, are there barriers to entry? Now, I actually don't look for barriers to entry when I launch the company. Especially if you build a marketplace business, there are no barriers to entry at launch. But actually, the execution of it leads to network effects that become a barrier to entry as you get scale. But at the beginning, you don't necessarily need them, but you need to think through what they will be in the future and what are the moats that will prevent others from coming and competing with you. Number 3, very important in marketplaces, less important in other ideas, is how fragmented is the market. And you need fragmentation both on the supply side and the demand side. If there's massive concentration in either side, most likely you are not actually building a marketplace. You're a distributor for the people that have the market power, and you're not going to be able to take a rake, and you are not going to have the ultimate network effect type dynamics of marketplaces. Number 4, what is the value proposition of what you're offering? And you need to make sure that you have a compelling value proposition for both the supply side and the demand side. Now, for all of these, of course, I'm giving the general categories. There will be specificity based on whatever idea you have. Number 5, are the unit economics compelling, which usually means you need either high average order value or recurrence, or ideally both. And you want to make sure that you're in a position to recoup your customer acquisition costs within 6 months. You want to maybe 2x it after 12 months and 3x it on a net contribution margin basis after 18 months. And then do you have scalable customer acquisition? Because even if you have product market fit, if the product is profitable and at a unit level, can you build a large business out of it because you found a way to acquire a lot of customers? And it doesn't really matter what it is. It could be a sales team if it's a B2B, it could be paid marketing, it could be viral if you have a viral loop, but you need to make sure that you have a repeatable, scalable acquisition channel that allows you to build this. Now, these are the 6 general categories. Of course, they have to be specific to the business you're going after. Now, the next thing I would do after you've defined what your hypotheses are is try to figure out what you think the unit economics are going to be. And so look at, what your average order value is, what the take rate is, what your COGS or cost of goods sold for the categories, or shipping, packaging, billing, etc. Then you get your contribution margin 1, then you remove the remaining costs and you get your contribution margin 2. Actually, payments are there. And you can either compare it to your customer acquisition costs or then decrease it and go to contribution margin theory. So I would take like I call it build a straw man of what you think the unit economics are going to be. You can typically find out what the average order value in the industry is, get a sense of what your cost of goods sold are going to be. These are reasonably easy to get to. And by the way, you should expect to be in line with the industry averages and not beyond them. Otherwise, they're not necessarily going to be particularly believable. So once you have your hypotheses and you have your Strawman unit economics, you need to go out and test it. Now, there are two ways that you test the hypotheses. One is you get secondary research, which means research that has already been conducted by others, that is readily available, that you can access, and that could be U.S. Industry reports, it could be K1s or S1s, it could be open APIs, or primary research, which is research you need to do yourself. And obviously, that one takes longer because you actually need maybe create a scraping engine to scrape and get the data, or hire someone to do it. You need to do marketing tasks or landing page analysis. But both or a component of both of these are going to be required. And what you use secondary research for is somewhat different from what you use primary research for. And I'll cover that briefly. So first of all, secondary research, I mean, there are a number of things you could look for that are readily available. There's a lot of like macro level information provided by the US government on how big different categories are. And that gives you the total addressable market size in various categories. And there's a IBIS, Statista, Nielsen. I mean, there's a lot of sources. Number two is you're evaluating things like competition. You can go to places like Crunchbase, where you can see who got funded, by how much, et cetera. Plus, of course, the other sources like TechCrunch, PitchBook, et cetera. And then for given verticals, you have industry publications, whether paid or not, and you can go to like Reddit or Twitter and see what people's perspectives are. And then specifically, you have access to different APIs. But basically, there's a fair amount of secondary research, and usually this is where you start. This will allow you top level to figure out total addressable market size, average order value, fragmentation. Most of these things can be figured out through secondary market research. Then there are three categories of primary research you want to do. One is customer discovery, so conversations, interviews, surveys with potential customers, mostly to test things like value proposition, but maybe even understanding what like the way the supply chain works, the way different elements of the business are. Number two is like marketing or sales tests, and they could be consumer facing, and they could be landing page analysis or customer acquisition cost analysis, or they can be sample sales conversations with B2B clients. And number three is like data collection that you need to do on your own to supplement the secondary research that's out there. And that's hiring people on Upwork to do the research. So as you're doing customer discovery, we thought through, okay, what would be, and it's not necessarily statistically significant, but maybe a sufficient minimum number of people that you need to talk to validate your value proposition. We came up with around 30 as a low starting point for understanding both the supply and the demand and getting a sense of their perspective on your idea. Now, you need to be really careful in the way you conduct these conversations and these interviews because most people want you to be happy, and so they want you. If you ask if they like your idea, most people want to please you, and they will say yes. And so the way you ask the question matters a lot, and you should check out the MOM test in terms of making sure that you're not asking leading questions where you're getting to the answer or the answer you want as opposed to the real answer. But I would have these in-depth conversations to really understand the value proposition and keep refining what it is that you're offering, because you want to make sure you're not offering, you're building a real company and not a feature, especially a feature that's easily replicable and that people may not value as much as you think they should. Next thing is when you're doing marketing and sales tests, here you're most likely going to be like landing page analysis on if it's a consumer facing product as you're evaluating what your customer acquisition costs are. Now you're going to be doing a lot of still assumptions in there, because even if you figure out what the customer acquisition cost is and they sign up to a landing page, you still need to think through what the conversion rate after that is going to be and compare and try to get a sense of how deep the customer acquisition channels are. But nonetheless, it still gives you a pretty good sense before you pull the trigger whether or not this works. Where it's harder probably is on the B2B side where you're doing a sales conversation. And it's harder because the sales cycles there are rather long, and so you really need to think through about the nuance of what people are telling you. do you think they will actually convert in terms of becoming customers if you actually launch the product? And so I would be way more careful about understanding exactly people's perspectives and willingness to pay in a B2B setting before pulling the trigger. Because people saying, oh, yeah, sure, why not, is very different from, okay, this is the RFP process. This is how you get in. This is how long it's going to take. And on average, on the B2B side, by the way, try to be in businesses where the sales cycle is less than 1 year. Frankly, ideally, a lot less than 1 year, where 3, 4, 5, 6 months, you can onboard the customers and you can verify whether or not you're going to be in a position to have an attractive business. The number three is very often the top-down macro analysis from secondary research is not sufficient to make sure and to validate the idea you have. You really want to go and look in depth at something. And so you you can complement the data that's available top down by doing things like scraping. So, for instance, we've noticed many sites actually put their categories or the top selling items online, and so you can actually just scrape them and see exactly what are what are their sales. You can completely reverse engineer the sales of sites, whether they're in the category and you're interested in whether the way the category works, or they're direct competitors and you're trying to think through what SKUs you should be offering. And you can do this, with data sets and frankly you can use this usually by hiring third parties. I mean, unless you know how to code, wouldn't expect you to do it yourself. And so you would go to Upwork and find people to do it, or there are companies like ZoomInfo or Rocket Reach to do this. Now, going back to the underlying original 6 assumptions, what you should try to validate with secondary research versus primary research. So the market size, you start with secondary research because you need to know how big the category is. But actually, that's not enough, because if you only do secondary market research, like, oh, the grocery market is huge. It's 545 billion a year. But the reality is, you may actually be going after a specific segment of it. Only staple foods that are high quality, that are targeting people with an income over 50K or 100K a year. And so you, in addition to your bottom down or top down analysis, you want a bottoms up analysis of the specific market you're going after, because it's very easy to like deceive yourself in believing the category you're going after is very large, whereas in fact perhaps the subsegment is small. Number two, on the competition side, typically that you can figure out online. You don't need to do any primary research. It's available, just basic Googling and looking at Crunchbase. You should be able to identify who the competitors are, what they do. Same thing, and whether or not the market is fragmented. And most of the general data in the industry you can find. The part where primary research is really important is value proposition. I mean, really make sure you understand the nuance of what you're offering. Who does it benefit the most, the supply or the demand, or both ideally? And what is it that they value in what you're offering? And keep refining your value proposition based on these conversations. And I really would recommend dozens of conversations to make sure, as you keep refining your thesis, to make sure that what you're offering is exactly what they want. Unit economic, I mean, what the business model could or should be. That could be secondary research, is what the market bears. What the average order value is secondary research. But then understanding the actual unit economics of what are the CPCs, what do you think the estimated CACs are, is usually primary research. And same thing on whether or not the acquisition channels are scalable is usually primary research, in terms of like understanding how many keywords and what the volume is for on Google or Facebook, or if you have a sales team, identifying who are the leads you can reach out to, what the sales cycle would look like, is all primary research. So let me give you a few specific examples, and then I'll invite someone to walk us through how she validated an entire idea from start to finish. So a few examples and of validating different things. So one is a value proposition validation. We had an idea that we should build a B2B manufacturing company. So it's a company that would sit between the beauty brands and the manufacturers. And the thesis that they were unhappy on both sides, frankly, with the conversation and the lack of transparency as to where the companies were in the building process, how much capacity they had in the factories, what pricing they could support, et cetera. And so perhaps building a marketplace between the beauty brands and the manufacturers that are mostly in Asia and in China would make a lot of sense. And so we actually sent an email pretending that we would offer this, and we reached out to 275 beauty brands and 100 beauty manufacturers. And actually, the original response was very encouraging. People were like, they opened the email, I mean, a 50% to 80% open rate, and then a 15 to 20% click through rate of people saying, "Hey, um, what we are interested, we want to know more." But as we started having conversations, we realized the beauty brands valued it, but the manufacturers didn't. So the supply side liked the opacity. They liked the fact that there was no competitive bidding mechanism on pricing between the different potential manufacturers. That the demand side could not actually understand what percentage of the revenues they represented, or what their overall current capacity was. And so because the supply side valued the opacity, we ultimately invalidated the idea. But as you can see, it took a while because we had to find out who the beauty brands were, who the beauty manufacturers were. We had to create an email that looked very legitimate, as though coming from a company in the space, to validate the value proposition, trying pricing, etc. And then we need to have conversations once they seemed intrigued, to verify whether or not this was something that would be interesting. And it took enough conversations, especially with the supply side, to realize, oh, this is not an idea that we should pursue. And so we invalidated it. Second example, and again, we invalidated for this category, and once you invalidate it for one, you invalidate it for all, so we killed the idea. Next example is Seafair. It's a marketplace that we considered launching this summer, which is a marketplace for seafarers. So the temporary staff that cruise um, oil tankers and the different ships that are basically managing the supply chains of the world economy. And so we wanted to make sure, can we make the economics work? Of course, we tested everything, but one of the things we wanted to test is testing the unit economics. And so what we tried here is we made a thesis that we could actually make that we can make the business work. Now, from a top level perspective, the category is absolutely huge, but the fact the category is huge, is like 20 billion a year, doesn't actually mean you can necessarily build a viable business. And so we wanted to know, okay, is how many ships do we think we can sign to get to an interesting business, and what would it look like? So we did a bunch of landing page analysis. So we targeted ads in the Philippines, where a lot of the supply and the seafarers are, and we realized we could buy the ads at like 1 cent a click, 2 cents a click, and our cost to acquire a seafarer on the supply side was like below a dollar. So that seemed to be pretty compelling. Then a combination of looking at what are the averages in the industry, how much are these seamen being paid, what the take rate of the competing agencies in the industry is, and what we think the variable cost structure would be like. And so we actually built it out, a combination of top down, meaning this is what the industry charges and bears, and this is what we think we can get our customer acquisition costs down to. And then we refined it after a few weeks as we looked what it would look like at scale, how we could decrease or increase different costs. And once we refined it, we realized, okay, if we can get to a rather low number of 1,000 ships, we can build a 500 million GMV business, and that's 2% of the market. So with 2% of the market, you can build a 500 million GMV business with about a $25 million contribution margin. That could be a multi-billion dollar company. And so we validated that the unit economics were valid here, and we said, okay, let's keep looking. Of course, ultimately, we had to validate everything from market size, competition, fragmentation, to value proposition and acquisition. But this is one case where we did, and we pulled the trigger. So now I'm going to invite one of our entrepreneurs in residence, Vivian, who's actually has been going through this for a lot of ideas, and she's going to walk us through one of the ideas she validated. But before you get started, Vivian, why don't you introduce yourself? Wait, I am not hearing you.
I was muted.
Okay,
Classic.
perfect.
All right. So, as Fabrice mentioned, my name is Vivian Graves. I currently work at FJ Labs as an entrepreneur in residence. In terms of my personal background, though, I grew up living between various countries in Latin America. And at that time, one of the only examples I had of a big tech company that I saw and admired as a kid was actually seeing ads on TV for what was then the eBay of Latin America, called derremate.com. Life has a very funny way of coming full circle because that company, I didn't know it at the time, but was actually co-founded by Fabrice and his partner at FJ Labs, Jose Marine. Fast forward years later, professionally, I started my career at JP Morgan, where I wrote and published research on the fixed income and currencies markets globally. But I always thought back to the remate and the amazing large scale impact that tech can have on society. And I knew that eventually I wanted to start my own company. So I decided to leave finance. I joined what was at that point a seed stage startup in New York called Care of, a totally amazing team, before pursuing my MBA at MIT. At this point, I've worked at FJ Labs now for 2 years in a variety of different roles. First, operating at an amazing prop tech company that was incubated at FJ Labs called Properly in Canada, as well as investing alongside the team here on the investment team before finally turning my attention to be an EIR full time. So let's see. So, okay. So Fabrice, do you have anything else to add or should I
No,
turn over to the
I
idea?
think that's I'll ask a few questions at the end, like, hey, how many ideas have you validated, whether you're getting close, etc. But for now,
Perfect.
yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I'll start with the idea. And then I'll jump into how I went into actually validating it. So first, what is the idea? Fabrice has touched on how there's so many different ways to come up with ideas in a previous session, but for me, it always starts with passion and thinking about what industries do I have a deep personal connection to. For context on the idea that I'm going to dig into, in 2018, I got a puppy, and of course, I was immediately obsessed with her. And that's when I really started looking into the pet industry. The industry is totally massive in the US at almost 100 billion. But when you look a little bit closer at what people are spending on, a huge portion of that actually goes to veterinary expenses. So I started doing a bit of digging alongside another EIR at the fund. And we found that by far the biggest part of a vet clinic's cost structure actually goes to labor. So we thought, can we build a labor marketplace for the vet industry that connects veterinarians with work at clinics and hospitals? So I'll turn it over to the next slide. I'd spent a long time previously researching what makes a labor marketplace work. And it's actually a space that FJ has very deep expertise in. They actually incubated a blue collar labor marketplace a few years ago. So on the surface, when I looked at all those criteria, the vet industry checked off a lot of key boxes. So the TAM just for the labor was 16 to 18 billion. There's a massive supply shortage across the US with more jobs than there are available talent. Temp and part-time work is very common, so what's known as gig work by some people. And at the same time, talent can be vetted and standardized since these are certified jobs that require some degree or certificate. In addition, the demand side is already used to paying a premium for temporary labor, and competition is old school. So on the surface, this all checked the boxes. So now that I had the idea, I needed to figure out what needs to be true for this to work. So I outlined the following 9 criteria, which are really a more broken down version of the key criteria that Fabrice outlined earlier, and started with what could we tackle most easily first. So in this case, it was, is there a clear value prop on both the demand and supply sides? In other words, what we started doing was pain point hunting, first and formally by casually talking to veterinarians and clinic owners, and also doing one of my favorite research methods, which is joining Facebook groups. So on Facebook, there's a huge number of different interest groups, either by profession or by interest or career or anything you can imagine. So what we did actually was we posed as vets on Facebook, joined a bunch of these Facebook groups to see what they were talking about, what pain points they were having. So here are just some snippets that I've included just as examples of the conversations we saw. But it was very clear right away that there was a huge pain point for hiring veterinary labor. Of course, getting just a few examples like this is only anecdotal. What counts is having a large enough sample size or an N that is saying the same thing. So we needed to talk to both the supply side and the demand side, so the clinic owners and the actual veterinarians, the employees, to validate this. So now it's not like you're going to publish a scientific journal, so you don't need to go crazy talking to hundreds of people, but you do need to find a quick and scalable way to talk to what I would say is 15 to 20 people, at least on each side. So what was our process? What we did was first, we hired an Upworker to scrape and compile a database of over 1,000 vet clinics, so their contact data. 2, we used a tool like Mail Merge to send out over 600 emails at once. So you should definitely not be sending out 600 emails manually. You send one email and it gets filtered out and customized for 600 different people. And then 3, this resulted in 45 or so actual interviews that we had with a veterinarian on the phone who was willing to talk to us about what it was like to run and own a practice. I do want to stress that most of your time here should be spent actually conducting customer interviews, not trying to set up and talk to people. That really is a waste of time. You want to maximize every hour you have so you can go through the idea as quick as possible. On the supply side, we did the same thing. We used an Upworker to scrape and compile a database of temporary vets, reached out to an initial portion of them and converted. We actually had a better conversion rate. So we converted 20 of those 40 to actual phone calls where we were able to talk and hear about their actual experiences as veterinarians working in temporary jobs. All right, so next, what we thought was, okay, let's define the business model and the monetization strategy. From that, we could reasonably deduce what would be the average order value, what would be the purchasing frequency, to get a rough sense of what the unit economics should look like. As we researched the vet industry further, though, it was very clear that the most compelling model for this segment was actually to build a staffing business model, meaning we would create a transactional marketplace that would connect short-term vets, which in the industry are known as relief vets, with vet clinics for flexible staffing positions, charging an industry standard rate of 15 to 20% take rate on what they were paid hourly. So staffing for relief vets was particularly compelling to us because it targeted the segment of labor that saw the most frequent transactions. So relief vets are normally hired on a weekly or daily basis for shifts when they have to fill open slots at a vet clinic. This would, in our mind, create network effects at scale so that we wouldn't need to spend time acquiring new supply for each transaction, and we could tap our talent pool for roles at different clinics. And this is something that is inherent to marketplaces. At the same time, vet clinics were already used to paying very high premiums to get relief vets through staffing agencies, so we weren't really changing behavior substantially. And then lastly, we felt that since there were no one-to-one relationships, meaning relief vets would source jobs from many different clinics, it was unlikely we would be disintermediated if we created the right tools and product. So what did this mean for unit economics? We started with what's called back of the envelope unit economics. So very rough surface level unit economics, but they did look very promising. So to walk you through the numbers I have here, we started with the average order value. In this case, that meant what were the average wages that were paid for a one-day shift for a relief vet. In this industry, it's around $1,000. We assumed with a 20% take rate, that meant we would be making $200 on each transaction. Now, there's a lot of other costs that we plan to hone in on later on in our process, such as customer acquisition costs, any variable costs. But at first pass, these numbers look good enough to move on to the next questions. That took us to market fragmentation. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. That took us to market fragmentation. So this is particularly important for marketplace businesses. Fabrice mentioned that earlier. Fortunately, in most cases, this question can be answered fairly quickly using secondary research such as Statista or reports from IBIS. We specifically looked at IBIS reports for this case, and we looked for what was the distribution of vet clinics by ownership. We found that the majority of the market is actually made up of small clinics or small chains of clinics, not a large chain of thousands of hospital units. And in fact, if we looked at the largest national consolidator, they only had 5% of the market. So it was very, very fragmented. And this was an easy check for us, and we could move on to the next question. Next, we looked at the competitive landscape. This was, for us, pretty easy since we had so many conversations with vets and clinics already through our primary research. The reality was that there was a pain point here and a problem because hiring for vets was such a tough thing. There was no really great option out there. Most of the tools or techniques that people use to find a temporary veterinarian were limited, were fragmented, inefficient, unscalable, things such as word of mouth, or just posting on Facebook. So it was pretty clear to us that there was not a huge competitor already out there. But what we also did was we combed through tech databases such as TechCrunch, looking for any direct competitors that had raised a substantial amount of money. At that point, we didn't find anyone who had raised beyond even a pre-seed. So we felt confident that there was no large incumbent that we would be going up against. That brought us to sales cycle. So the question for us was, could we lock in the demand side, meaning contracts with vet clinics and hospitals, in a relatively limited time frame, specifically under a year? Here, we definitely had to get very creative. As Fabrice mentioned earlier, it's not always the easiest, especially when you're doing B2B sales tests. So what we decided to do was to first set up a website using a low-code landing page builder. There's a lot of options out there. Specifically, I like to use landin.co since you can get a professional-looking landing page up and running within a day. And again, the key here is speed. Do not spend weeks or lots of money building this because it's just ultimately going to be a waste of time. And there's a lot of different options out there that can make this pretty quick and scalable. So we did this actually for two different reasons. So one, we wanted to give the impression that we were an up and running business, a legitimate business. And two, we wanted to, sorry, I'm having a technical issue here. Okay, we wanted to give the impression that we were an up and running business. And two, we would be able to then later use this landing page to test the supply side and to test CAC through digital marketing if it actually got to that. So it was something we could do to test now and also for future use. So next we set up a sales test. What we did is we created a sales script and we basically put together a full sales plan. We leveraged the thousands of vet clinic contacts that we had scraped earlier. We reached out to first 150 contacts via a drip campaign of 5 emails. Again, this was automated using mail merge tools. We did not write 150 emails times 5. And that was mixed in with some phone calls to just the high potential leads, as well as some LinkedIn outreach. What we deemed as a success was if a customer was willing on our call to pay for access to the platform, which of course did not exist. So we never actually took any payments, but this was enough for us to gauge who was truly interested. Then we compared that to the typical sales stats that you can expect from a cold outbound process. So we found this just from research online, public research available. And we found that our conversion rate of around 5% was pretty in line with the industry standard. We'd only taken about 2 weeks to go from start to finish and close these leads. And we assumed that with a real sales team, we would be able to scale this process much better and potentially improve the conversion. So obviously, I don't have experience in sales. Someone who is well-versed, very experienced, would probably be able to do this much better than we did. So then we moved on to the next category, given this check the surface level box. That brought us to competitive moat or differentiation. This I'll only touch on briefly since we didn't actually do any testing, but given all of our prior research, our hypothesis was that we could create a moat by building liquidity on a city-by-city basis. So this is very key for local service marketplaces. From there, we assumed that we would be able to provide tools and features to prevent any disintermediation or off-platforming. That brought us to TAM, or total addressable market. The question is TAM big enough, assuming that you take a small share of the pie with a relatively small take rate? Now, this is a criteria that should be your starting point. And in fact, it was our starting point. We had found that veterinary labor was around 16 to 18 billion market initially. That being said, though, this is total wages paid out to vet clinic staff over the course of a whole year, not the revenue that we would make. So as a marketplace, we would only make a percentage of what we estimated the GMV to be. So the total transactions going on the marketplace. I've included here a breakdown of each role within a vet clinic by turnover, frequency, number of employees, and salary. And as you can see, what we were really optimizing for when we picked these temporary or relief vets was for all these 3 functions. Temporary work was the only one where we found high frequent transactions, meaning it was one of the only ones where we could charge a take rate on each transaction. If you look at the veterinarian category, a full-time vet doesn't have that much turnover. Ideally, a vet clinic wants to keep a vet for at least a year, if not many years at a time. So we didn't feel we could take a take rate on those transactions. Now, there's no published data available at this point on the size of this temporary or relief vet market. So we had to get creative again and make various assumptions. But this was helpful for us to get an approximation of what was the general TAM that we could assume. So I'll walk you guys through how we thought through the numbers. First, we outlined what are the total number of vet clinics out there. There's 30,000 vet clinics in the US. How many vet clinics were within our target size, right? So the smaller chains or the single unit veterinarian clinics. That was around 74% of the market that either use weekly or every month hired relief vets. So that brought it down to 22,000. What was the average frequency of usage that they would hire relief vets? We found on average and conservatively 3 times per month.
And
so we
just to, and sorry to interrupt, so total vet clinics, you probably got, you got that from IBIS data?
Yes, so we got it from IBIS data. Statista, I'm sure, would probably have it as well.
And the breakdown of like, okay, you're going after the long tail or the ones that don't have many units, you also got that from IBIS, I take it.
Yes. So IBIS is actually a wonderful resource, and for industries such as the vet industry, we got so much of our data from that.
And the frequency of usage, was that based on conversations or was that also public?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That was not public. A lot of this information we had to just garner from our primary research, which were the conversations we had with vet clinic owners or veterinarians themselves. So we went more conservative with our estimates, but this was generally what we heard across the board. So we kept hearing the same things. We assumed this should be the right number to judge.
Okay.
Cool. So from that, we assumed that the total jobs per month were around 67,000. We were assuming that a vet does around 10 jobs per month with us. We would need about 7,000 relief vets or temporary vets to fill this demand. In total, what that meant was around 800,000 jobs per year that needed to be filled. Again, going back to the rough unit economics that we did, the AOV for one day shift was $1,000. If we took 20%, the revenue.
And again, the
would be
AOV you got from conversations with how much they were paying and how much it was costing them to have a shift for a day. Okay.
So we got that from conversations, both with the vets that were hiring, the vet clinics, as well as the vets that were working. But we also reached out to a lot of the current industry staffing agencies to get a sense of how much they were charging. So that would be the higher end of what we could reasonably charge. So that took us to $200 for a one-day shift. You put that all together, what was the total amount of transactions that we reasonably believe that were going on in the market, or the GMV? That's 800 million. So not even hitting the 1 billion mark. If we were taking the 20% take rate, that meant that our total revenue that we could estimate was around 160 million. That's far smaller than, the initial 16 to 18 billion that we had looked at when we looked at the market on a surface level.
And by the way, that's if you capture 100% of the market.
Exactly. So our conclusion was TAM is not big enough, but I think it's important to think about when small TAM can be a good thing, because I don't think in every scenario this will kill your idea or means you should walk away. There's 2 cases in which small TAM can be a good thing. This is something that Fabrice has also talked about before, inherent to marketplaces. So one is if you can increase the size of the pie. So do you reasonably believe that with your solution, you'll be able to grow the market either by unlocking dormant demand and or supply? Some examples of this are, for example, Rent the Runway. The rental industry of renting clothing didn't really exist and wasn't a multiple billion-dollar market until they came in and created a new solution and essentially created the market. Also goes another example, one of my favorites is StockX. The market, many people said, oh, you can't create a marketplace just for selling used high-end sneakers. In fact, by creating an amazing solution like they did, they were able to grow the market even further than what was currently going on. The second
Actually, probably Airbnb too, because in a way, what Airbnb, at least as it was started originally, was happening on Craigslist before Airbnb in terms of like,
Totally.
it's just that the experience was horrible because there was no payment, there was no reviews, there was
Yeah.
no in the calendar, and I think it was sub a billion a year in GMV. And so it would have looked
Totally.
on the outside like a small market, and now it's tens of billions because the solution really grew the market.
Exactly. So definitely that to the point, you shouldn't just be scared away by a small TAM. It's important to think through it properly. For our idea specifically, we felt from all our conversations, and again, this was more through our primary research, we didn't feel that we could increase the size of the pie substantially more than what people were already engaging in. Vet clinic owners did not want to transfer their full staff to being temporary or part time. They actually preferred having a lot of their staff be full time. So we did not think we could increase the size of the pie. The second case in which small TAM can be a good thing is if you can eventually go into a conjoined category, leveraging either your supply side or your demand side to expand into another area or another industry. So an example of this, they are not currently doing this, but a company that FJ has invested in that we love is called Trusted Health. So what they do is they're a marketplace connecting temporary registered nurses with jobs at different hospitals. So this seems very similar to and analogous to ours with the vet industry. That being said, Trusted could reasonably in the future leverage their existing contracts with hospitals or different clinics to say, okay, now we will also enable hiring temporary staff for medical doctors or medical assistants, many different other functions, leveraging their demand side to create and go into another industry. In our case, we initially thought, okay, perhaps we could go into other categories that have similar dynamics, similar trends, such as the dental industry or other human medical industries. But once we thought about it, the supply side was different, the demand side was different, so there were no synergies that we could really leverage. So that was also crossed off for us. So in conclusion, small TAM can be a good thing. For our idea, we felt it was a deal breaker, and we decided to move away from the idea and not pursue.
So how long did it take you for this idea from like the day you had the idea to the day you did all the tests and to killing it? Because
Yeah.
obviously a lot of work clearly went into this.
Yeah, so it was a lot of work, and keep in mind that it was two of us doing this, so we were able to move really, really quickly. We leveraged a lot of tools such as using Upworkers or mail merge to really optimize our time. But it took us around, I'd say, 1 to 2 months to go from start to finish. And this, for context, is to go all the way through all the criteria to really flesh out each one to what we reasonably believed was a good answer. So roughly, I would say 2 months.
And the beauty manufacturing idea, how long did that take to invalidate?
That one, from what I remember, was around a month. But that again was killed fairly earlier in the process, and we didn't go into every single category.
So in terms of tools you use, so we talked a little bit about like mail merge in terms of like sending obviously a lot of emails. What's the landing page tool that you like the best?
So the one I like the best is landon.co, but there's many out there. They are paid.
landin.co?
LANDEN.
Den.co, okay. Landin.co.
.co.
Okay, great.
There are many out there. They are paid, but it's pretty cheap just for the most basic plan. So I'd say around, I don't know, $10 to $15.
The any other tools you use that you think are interesting, paid or free?
Yeah, so I'd say the two things we leveraged the most was really Upwork. We found that there's a lot of amazing, highly skilled talent that you can get for a relatively low cost, and they can be way more efficient than you can, right? So a lot of the scraping we did would have taken us days, if not weeks, to get so much data. Instead, we hired amazing scrapers that were able to get that in the matter of 24 hours. Second, what we also leverage, and something that I don't actually hear about very often, is Facebook communities or Facebook groups. Facebook has a wealth of knowledge if you're just able to go in and tap into these Facebook groups to hear what people are talking about. And often we would actually reach out to those people individually and ask, are you willing to talk about your experience? People are more kind than you might believe, and most people are actually pretty willing to talk about their experiences and just tell you about what their life is like.
Yeah, no, people definitely love to talk about themselves, and so you can get even frankly competitors to tell you what they're doing and their entire life story. And I see
Yeah.
Vincent is suggesting that London just renamed themselves umso.com. Thanks, Vincent.
Oh, breaking news from
Breaking
Vincent.
news, exactly. Um, Salome wants to know if you can't grow the TAM and if you can't go in conjoint categories, what do you think is the minimum acceptable TAM?
I'll let you take this one, Fabrice, given your experience.
Yeah, I spent a fair amount of time thinking about this. I mean, ultimately, you want to build a $1 billion company. So, what would a $1 billion company look like? If you're a B2B SaaS company, you need probably about 100 million in revenues, I'd say, given that you have a like 95% gross margin. And obviously, you're not going to capture the entire market. So I'd say in the software market, it could be somewhat smaller TAMs, but I'd probably go for like $1 billion market for the software. In the marketplace space, if you want to create a $1 billion company, you probably need, if you have a 20% take rate, yeah, probably $1 billion in GMV, where you make 200 million net revenues and 150 million in margin out of that. And so you probably need on the low end, probably 5 billion, and that's on the low end. I mean, we looked at and most of the companies we've gone after that are at 5 billion in markets have usually had an opportunity to increase the market size. So we look at Rebag. The secondary market for handbags is rather small. It was probably in the $4 or $5 billion range, but we got comfortable with it because we're like, well, a lot of the reason it doesn't exist if you're afraid of buying fakes on eBay. But if you actually remove that fear of them being fake, perhaps you can increase the market. And so we actually looked at the primary market, and then we looked at the entire inventory of handbags out in the market. We realized, wow, every year if there's 5 billion of handbags sold, even though the secondary market was hundreds of millions, it was tiny. The primary market is like about 5 billion, but if you look at the value of all the inventory out there, it's probably like 50 billion or 100 billion. Even though the market looks like it's only a couple hundred million for use backs, do we think we can tap into that? And the answer was yes. So of course that was a market expansion play. But I'd say if you can't grow the market, probably 5 billion when it's products or services. On the low end, maybe 10 billion to be safer, and maybe $1 billion on the software side. Uh,
Agreed.
Brandon is asking, can we elaborate on what's how do you analyze market fragmentation?
Yeah, so it really depends on obviously the industry you're looking into and what the idea is. For us, market fragmentation meant we didn't want to find out or see that on the supply side and the demand side there was a huge player that was really taking up all of the market, right? So to use a specific example with the veterinary industry, if we had found that, for example, Banfield, which is a chain of vet clinics and vet hospitals, if they owned, let's say, 80% of the market, you could reasonably assume that they would be able to create their own solution in order to interface with all of these relief vets. For example, they could have a database of all the relief vets and just reach out to them directly. What made it particularly compelling was because it was so fragmented, there's so many clinics out there trying to interact with so many different individual relief vets. They really needed an intermediary to facilitate and enable this transaction. So we would actually be adding a lot of value by helping them interact and helping them manage this relationship. Now, if you have just one single player on one side interacting with various other supply side players, then it becomes a different equation, and sometimes they can manage it themselves. So, for a marketplace to really take hold, you need to be actually creating value and really helping facilitate these transactions. And that often happens and works most frequently when both sides have a lot of fragmentation.
And as a follow-up question, what is our definition of vertical versus category versus segment? I guess it's kind of semantics.
Yeah,
I guess a vertical,
I think
yeah,
they're
interchangeable.
interchangeable.
Exactly. A vertical is a category, is a segment. And so, are there top-down databases that lay out the different verticals, the categories, and I guess and who the competitors are? So I think to answer your question, Branko, that I think the top-down databases we kind of mentioned is IBIS and Statista,
Mhm.
and they're great. Now for the competition, though, they're not presented there. It's really macro data. Those you find by doing Google research and frankly, if it's tech, Crunchbase and TechCrunch and seeing who got funded. Well, TechCrunch will tell you who exists in the category, and then Crunchbase will tell you how much funding they got and from whom. If you have PitchBook, even better, but PitchBook is expensive, so most people don't have access
Yeah.
to it. So yeah, Crunchbase public data is frankly good enough. Anything else? Yeah.
And the other two that the other two I'll note. So PitchBook is very expensive. IBIS is paid as well. In terms of the free solutions that are out there, there's actually a lot of public government data, either on the census website or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, that does actually provide a lot of high level, top down research on what are all the different industries that make up the US economy. What does it look like broken down? How big are these segments? How many people working within each one? How much are they making? So, depending on what you need it for, that can actually be a really great starting point. The only thing that I'll caution you is sometimes it can be so high level that you can get kind of lost in the weeds of what you're looking at. So oftentimes, if you know of a specific pain point and you can start bottoms up there, looking at how big that industry is, that maybe can be a better starting point instead of just going and trying to filter through, basically boiling the ocean of data.
David is asking, so he's fighting against the old traditional sports voucher providers. It was a great idea 40 years ago. How does he evaluate whether or not it's still profitable and scalable today and in the future? How would you go about it?
I have to admit, I don't know what the sports vouchers are because I don't really follow that industry. Fabrice, do you know?
I don't either. But frankly, again, taking a step back, and a
Yeah.
lot of the tools and the processes that we described today are applicable, right? So how big the
Yeah.
industry is industry data, whether or not the unit economics work, and you have scalable acquisition channels, landing page analysis, density analysis on Google and Facebook, looking at the CPAs versus what the average order industry would be, and seeing the economics work, and verifying that your value proposition. So I don't know what a sports voucher is specifically, but the process, frankly, is the same kind of regardless of the
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, and the way that I always like to start is just it can seem a little daunting to just tackle this huge idea and really try to validate everything. And a lot of people will say, like, oh, but this isn't going to work. That's not going to work. I think the easiest thing to do is just write down what are the key criteria for your specific idea to work, and then try to figure out what are the ones I can tackle most easily and most quickly, and go just one step at a time in bite sized pieces, not try to tackle everything as a whole because you'll get overwhelmed.
So is that what I use for Zingy and for OLX? So the answer is no to the first, yes to the second. So for Zingy, I in a way had come after the failure of my first startup, where I'd gone from hero to zero overnight as the bubble burst, but I wanted to be a tech entrepreneur, and I was willing to compromise on many of the criteria in order to be a tech entrepreneur. And in fact, I thought there was no way people were going to be building billion-dollar companies in the future. The internet was dead. It's not going to be this big thing. And as a result, my only criteria, frankly, was can I build a profitable business with very limited capital in a time where no capital was available, and everything else was irrelevant. The and I'd seen this idea work elsewhere. I validated I could do it in the U.S. and I went and executed it. But the objective was not building a billion-dollar company. Once later, after I sold that company, it turned out the internet wasn't dead after all. I went back to my criteria, and frankly, it's the same criteria I used for the first company I built, which was an eBay for Europe. And so the criteria from that perspective have not really changed. Now, do I think these are the criteria that Zuckerberg or Musk or Bezos used? Yes and no. So Zuckerberg, absolutely not. It was more like a cool site he wanted to build, and it turns out that it led to a lot more. And so he didn't necessarily think through business model, unit economics, etc. And it's not to say that you need to use this process. The thing is, the 5-year survival rate of a startup is 7%. If you don't use this process and you just launch a passion project, your likelihood of failure is really high. It doesn't mean that it's not going to succeed. There are definitely counterexamples, and Google also falls in that category. The Google founders never thought through what the business model was going to be. They just found a better way to do search, and later kind of stumbled into a business model when another company, GoTo, invented it. And so it's not required, but it helps. Now, Amazon, Jeff Bezos was way more deliberate. He said, okay, I'm launching with books because books have a long tail. That long tail is not going to be addressed by the Barnes and Nobles in the world because they cannot have infinite inventory. I'm going to be in Seattle because that's where Ingram, the biggest book publisher in the world, distributor in the world, is located. Therefore, I'm going to have access to inventory quickly. I'm going to be able to distribute. So he was deliberate, and if you look at almost everything he's done from the launch to today, it's been like continuing the same underlying vision and delivering on his original thesis. So for him, deliberate. For others, it's more a passion project that then they try to make work into because they absolutely wanted it to happen. I don't think Elon did an analysis of like business model, but he was like, I want to electrify the 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 transportation system, and I want to get people to Mars. How do we go about doing that? And it wasn't driven by in general market analysis as opposed to a passion project, which is by the way totally fine. And it's just many passion projects end up not being particularly large or particularly successful, though we do have counterexamples. So, how many ideas have you evaluated, Vivian, since you started the IR process and killed?
A lot of ideas. I think I have lost count at this point, but one thing that's important to keep in mind is oftentimes when you're validating ideas, it really isn't this 2 month process of going through every single criteria. What works best is if you try to kill ideas quickly and early to figure out, okay, this doesn't work, let me move on. With this vet idea, it was particularly painful because we found that there really was such a strong need for this in the market, and we really connected with the industry. But I think the ideal solution for ideation is to go as quickly as you can and to move on to the next thing when you find that the answers you're getting aren't really what you are looking for.
So, how far do you think you are from launching your company?
I would say very, very close.
Good. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for joining, and we will be off next week for Thanksgiving, and I guess we'll restart the next episode on December 3. So, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Fabrice.